Never hurt an empath. The consequences are brutal. Listen carefully. Some of the most dangerous mistakes people make in life come from misreading soft people. They see calmness and call it weakness. They see patience and call it passivity. They see forgiveness and assume unlimited tolerance. That is where they fail. An empath is not fragile because they feel deeply. An empath is powerful because they feel deeply. They notice what others miss. They read what others hide. They sense shifts in tone, energy, intention, and motive long before words ever confess the truth. So when someone decides to lie to an empath, manipulate an empath, betray an empath, or emotionally exploit one, they are not getting away with something. They are being studied by someone who understands human behavior on a level they themselves may not even understand. That is the first lesson. Empaths do not always respond quickly, and that confuses people. Why? Because most people expect pain to make noise. But empathic people often process pain in silence. They observe, they replay, they connect the dots, they compare words to actions, they review inconsistencies. And while the other person thinks, I won, the empath is reaching a conclusion. And once that conclusion is reached, something changes. Not loudly, not theatrically, but permanently. That is the second lesson. When an empath finally sees the full truth of who someone is, they stop arguing with potential. They stop negotiating with excuses. They stop trying to heal what keeps choosing to hurt them. And that is where the consequences become brutal. Not because the empath becomes cruel, but because they become clear. Their energy withdraws, their loyalty disappears, their access closes. Their presence becomes unavailable. People who took them for granted suddenly realize what they lost. They lost the person who understood them without explanation. They lost the person who forgave more than they should have. They lost the person who gave real support, real patience, real emotional labor, and real loyalty. And here is the irony. Most people only understand the value of an empath after the empath is gone. That is the brutal part. Because some losses do not come back. Some doors do not reopen. Some hearts do not reattach once they have finally accepted the truth. This is the educational lesson people need to understand. Empaths are not here to be emotional storage units for unstable behavior. They are not here to absorb dishonesty. They are not here to keep offering grace to people committed to disrespect. Yes, they care deeply. Yes, they try hard. Yes, they often give second chances. But repeated injury creates a transformation. At first they hope. Then they question, then they understand, then they detach. And once an empath detaches with full awareness, what you are left with is not a wounded person chasing closure. You are left with a person who finally knows their value. That is a force, because a healed empath is different. A healed empath no longer confuses kindness with self-sacrifice. A healed empath no longer stays where peace is repeatedly stolen. A healed empath no longer explains boundaries to those who only respected access. They become disciplined. They become selective, they become precise, and that version of them is nearly impossible to manipulate. So the message is simple. Never hurt an empath and assume nothing will happen. Something will happen. You may not see it immediately. There may be no scene, no dramatic exit, no public retaliation. But one day you will reach for the warmth you once had access to, and it will not be there. You will look for the understanding. Gone. The patience. Gone. The belief in you. Gone. The emotional safety you kept abusing. Gone. And then you will understand too late. The strongest people are not always the loudest. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who loved deeply, endured quietly, saw everything, and then chose themselves. So if you are an empath, hear this clearly. Your sensitivity is not your weakness. Your compassion is not your weakness. Your ability to feel, to read, to care, and to connect is not something to apologize for. But your growth begins the moment you stop giving sacred access to careless people. Protect your mind. Protect your peace. Protect your nervous system. Protect your heart. Because not everyone deserves the depth you carry. And if someone keeps mistaking your grace for weakness, let them learn the hard way. Not through revenge, through absence, through boundaries, through silence, through your refusal to bleed, just to keep someone else comfortable. That is not cruelty. That is self-respect. And in the end, the greatest consequence of hurting an empath is this. They rise. They heal. They outgrow the damage, and they become unreachable to the people who once thought they would always stay. That is brutal. That is powerful. And that is the lesson. If you want, I can also turn this into, an empath is often misunderstood because people confuse emotional sensitivity with weakness, when in reality sensitivity is usually a sign of heightened awareness, deeper pattern recognition, and stronger internal perception, which means the empath is not simply feeling more than others, but noticing more, processing more, and understanding more beneath the surface than most people ever realize. This is why hurting an empath carries such serious consequences, because the damage does not end at the moment of betrayal, disrespect, manipulation, or neglect. It begins there and then grows into a quiet but powerful transformation inside the person who has been wounded. Since empaths rarely react in shallow or immediate ways and instead tend to observe, absorb, analyze, and connect the meaning of repeated behavior over time, which means that while another person may think they have lied successfully, controlled the situation, or escaped accountability, the empath is often gathering evidence emotionally, psychologically, and behaviorally until the full picture becomes undeniable. This is where the educational lesson becomes important, because the true consequence of hurting an empath is not that they suddenly become dramatic, vindictive, or destructive, but that they eventually become clear, and clarity in a deeply caring person is one of the most irreversible forces in human relationships. Since once an empath fully accepts that someone's actions are intentional rather than accidental, repeated rather than isolated, and harmful rather than misunderstood, they stop investing energy into excuses and start protecting themselves with a level of certainty that can feel brutal to the person who took their kindness for granted. That brutality is not violence, revenge, or cruelty. It is emotional withdrawal, loss of access, the closing of trust, and the end of unearned closeness. Because the empath who once listened, supported, forgave, encouraged, and remained available no longer offers the same emotional shelter, and many people only recognize the value of that shelter after they have destroyed it through carelessness. What makes this especially powerful is that empaths often give more chances than most, which creates the illusion that they will always stay, always understand, and always recover the connection no matter how many times they are disappointed. But repeated harm changes the nervous system, the expectations, and the boundaries of even the most compassionate person. And when that change happens, the empath learns one of life's hardest lessons. Kindness without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. From that point forward, growth begins, and the empath who has learned from pain becomes far more discerning, far less available to chaos, and much harder to manipulate, because they are no longer responding only from compassion. They are now responding from wisdom. And wisdom teaches them that not every apology reflects change, not every tear reflects truth, and not every connection deserves continued access to their heart. This is why people should never mistake gentleness for fragility, because the gentlest people often have the strongest thresholds once crossed, and when an empath reaches that point, they may not argue loudly, explain endlessly, or seek public justice, but they will leave emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically, and that departure can be devastating precisely because it is calm, final, and deeply informed. The person left behind then faces the real consequence, which is not punishment imposed from the outside but realization rising from the inside. The realization that they lost someone rare, someone who saw the best in them, someone who tried to understand them, someone who gave patience beyond reason, and someone whose loyalty was a gift rather than an entitlement. For the empath, however, the greatest lesson is not about making others regret hurting them, but about recognizing their own value soon enough to stop offering sacred energy to people committed to mishandling it. Because emotional depth is not a weakness to hide, it is a strength to manage wisely, and the healthiest empath is not the one who can endure endless damage, but the one who knows when compassion must be paired with distance, when understanding must be paired with standards, and when love must be paired with self-respect. So the message is motivational as much as it is cautionary. If you are an empath, do not shrink your sensitivity just because the world contains careless people. Strengthen your boundaries, trust your observations, and remember that your peace is worth protecting. And if you are someone dealing with an empath, value their presence while you have it, because once a deeply loving person reaches the point where they no longer plead, no longer explain, and no longer fight to keep the bond alive, the silence that follows is not emptiness. It is the sound of a lesson arriving too late. An empath is often misunderstood because many people confuse emotional depth with emotional weakness, when in reality the opposite is usually true. The person who feels deeply is often the person who notices deeply, interprets deeply, and understands human behavior with unusual accuracy. An empath does not simply react to words, they register tone, inconsistency, hesitation, emotional shifts, and the hidden gap between what someone says and what someone truly means. That is why hurting an empath is such a serious mistake. The damage may not produce an immediate explosion, dramatic confrontation, or obvious retaliation, so the careless person assumes there will be no real consequence. But empaths rarely process pain in shallow ways. They absorb what happened, reflect on it, compare it to patterns from the past, and slowly arrive at a conclusion that is often more complete than the offender expects. In an educational sense, this matters because it teaches us that human relationships are not sustained by appearances alone. They are sustained by trust, and trust is something an empath monitors with great sensitivity. Once betrayal, manipulation, dishonesty, or repeated disrespect becomes clear, the empath begins to change internally. At first, they may still try to explain, forgive, or repair the bond, because compassionate people naturally want understanding before separation. However, repeated harm teaches them that kindness without limits becomes self-neglect. This is the point many people fail to recognize. The empath is not weak because they gave chances. The empath is strong because even after being hurt, they still tried to act with maturity. But if the harmful behavior continues, their compassion becomes informed by wisdom, and wisdom is what transforms the relationship. The real consequence of hurting an empath is not revenge in the ordinary sense. It is the gradual loss of their emotional presence. The person who once offered patience, support, attention, and sincere care begins to withdraw those things, not impulsively, but deliberately. They stop over-explaining, stop defending the connection, and stop making excuses for behavior that repeatedly wounds them. This withdrawal can feel brutal because it reveals how much the other person depended on the empath's loyalty, calmness, and emotional field labor. In other words, the empath's silence becomes a lesson. It teaches that gentle people are not powerless people, and that the absence of immediate conflict does not mean the absence of consequence. Sometimes the deepest consequence is that a person who truly cared no longer feels safe enough to care in the same way. And once that shift happens, the relationship may never return to what it was before. What makes this lesson especially powerful is that the greatest consequence is usually not what happens to the empath, but what happens to the one who underestimated them. Many people only understand the worth of emotional sincerity after they lose access to it. They notice too late that the empath was the one who listened without judgment, remembered small details, sensed pain without being told, and offered support even when they themselves were tired. When such a person reaches the point of emotional clarity and chooses distance, the loss can be severe because what disappears is not just companionship, but emotional safety, trust, and genuine understanding. From an educational point of view, this teaches two major truths. First, never interpret patience as permission to continue harmful behavior. Second, never assume a good-hearted person will remain available forever simply because they once loved deeply. Empaths do not become strong by becoming cold. They become strong by learning boundaries. A healed empath understands that self-respect is not selfishness, and that protecting peace is not cruelty. They no longer stay in places where their sensitivity is mocked, their loyalty is exploited, or their forgiveness is treated like an unlimited resource. Instead, they learn to place standards around their compassion. This is why the idea that the consequences are brutal should not be understood as a threat, but as a warning about reality. The brutal part is not destruction, it is finality. Once an empath has fully seen the truth of a person's character, they may leave quietly, but they leave with understanding, and that kind of departure is often permanent. There is no dramatic performance because none is needed. Their absence communicates what words once tried to teach. For the empath, the final lesson is empowering. Sensitivity is not something to be ashamed of, but something to protect with intelligence. Their gift is not merely that they can feel more, but that they can transform pain into wisdom and kindness into discernment. For everyone else, the lesson is just as important. If you are trusted by someone deeply intuitive and deeply caring, treat that trust with respect. Do not test the loyalty of people whose hearts are rare. Do not exploit those who see the good in you, and do not mistake softness for weakness, because some of the strongest people in the world are the ones who stay gentle while learning when to walk away. When an empath finally chooses themselves, the result is powerful, unforgettable, and often irreversible, and that is why hurting one is never a small mistake. An empath is often misunderstood because many people judge strength only by what is visible on the surface. If a person is calm, kind, patient, emotionally available, and slow to anger, others may assume that person is easy to control, easy to deceive, or easy to wound without consequence. But that assumption is usually wrong. An empath does not simply feel emotions more strongly. An empath also notices emotional detail more accurately. They pay attention to tone, pauses, inconsistency, emotional shifts, hidden tension, and the difference between words and behavior. In educational terms, this means an empath often has advanced social perception. They may detect insincerity before it is openly revealed, and they may recognize manipulation long before other people can name it. The reason hurting an empath becomes such a serious mistake is not because the empath instantly attacks or creates chaos, but because they process pain deeply and intelligently. They observe what happened, they reflect on repeated patterns, and they slowly form a complete understanding of the relationship. While another person may think, they are quiet, so they must not know, the empath is often studying the whole situation with greater clarity than anyone realizes. That is why kindness should never be confused with blindness. A compassionate person is not always naive. Sometimes that person is simply giving space for truth to reveal itself. When someone repeatedly lies to, betrays, exploits, or emotionally drains an empath, the harm does not disappear just because the empath remains polite for a while. Instead, the injury moves inward, where it is examined carefully. The empath begins asking important questions. Is this behavior accidental or intentional? Is this an isolated mistake or a pattern? Is this relationship based on mutual respect or only on access to my energy? These questions matter because they lead to the moment when emotion becomes understanding, and understanding changes everything. The real consequence of hurting an empath is usually not dramatic revenge but permanent clarity. This is what many people fail to understand. They expect conflict to be loud, immediate, and visible, so when the empath does not explode, they assume they are safe from consequences. But the deepest consequences in human relationships are often quiet. Once an empath fully understands that their care is being abused, their loyalty is being taken for granted, or their trust is being repeatedly broken, they begin to detach. Detachment is not coldness in the shallow sense. It is a protective psychological response based on learning. In education and psychology, this can be understood as boundary formation after repeated emotional injury. At first, the empath may try to repair the connection because caring people naturally want to heal rather than abandon. They may explain themselves, forgive more than once, and hope the other person will grow. But if the damaging behavior continues, the empath eventually realizes that endless understanding without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. That realization is powerful. It turns pain into self-respect. It teaches the empath that compassion does not require self-destruction. When this shift happens, the other person begins to experience the true cost of their behavior. They lose emotional access. They lose the patience that once covered their immaturity. They lose the listening ear, the genuine support, the warmth, the emotional safety, and the belief that someone will keep giving no matter what. This can feel brutal not because the empath becomes cruel, but because the empath stops offering what was once freely given. In many cases, people only understand the value of a deeply caring person after that person becomes unavailable. They realize too late that the empath was the one who understood them beyond words, tolerated flaws others would not tolerate, and stayed loyal far longer than was reasonable. The lesson here is not that empaths are dangerous in a theatrical way. It is that the loss of a sincere, emotionally intelligent person is a consequence that cannot easily be repaired once trust is gone. The most important educational lesson in this topic is that the message should lead to respect, not fear. Never hurt an empath does not mean people should walk around afraid of revenge. It means they should understand the value of emotional depth and stop mistaking gentleness for weakness. It also means empaths themselves must learn to protect their gift. Sensitivity is not a flaw that needs to be hidden. It is a strength that needs wise boundaries. A healthy empath is not someone who can survive unlimited mistreatment while remaining sweet and available. A healthy empath is someone who can love deeply while also recognizing when love is no longer safe. They learn that being understanding does not mean accepting repeated disrespect. They learn that forgiveness does not always require reconnection. They learn that peace is more valuable than proving loyalty to people who misuse it. This growth transforms the empath from someone who absorbs too much pain into someone who channels emotional insight with discipline. That version of the empath becomes difficult to manipulate because they no longer ignore red flags in the name of compassion. They still care, but they care with standards. They still love, but they love with self-respect. And that is why hurting an empath becomes such a major mistake. Not because they destroy others, but because they eventually stop abandoning themselves. Once they reach that stage, their silence carries meaning, their absence carries consequence, and their boundaries are very truth. For anyone listening, the lesson is simple and powerful. Value the people who care sincerely before their care turns into distance. If you are trusted by someone emotionally perceptive, protect that trust. If you are an empath, do not apologize for your depth. Strengthen your boundaries and honor your worth. In the end, the harshest consequence of hurting an empath is often this: they heal, they see clearly, and they become unavailable to the people who thought their kindness would last forever. An empath is often misunderstood because many people judge strength by volume, aggression, or visible dominance, while emotional depth is wrongly treated as fragility. In reality, an empath's greatest strength is not loudness but perception. Such a person notices what others overlook: the hesitation in a voice, the mismatch between words and actions, the emotional tension behind a smile, and the small behavioral patterns that reveal true character over time. This is why hurting an empath is never a small act. The damage is not limited to one rude comment, one betrayal, or one selfish decision. It creates a chain reaction inside someone who processes human behavior with unusual depth. In educational terms, empaths are often highly responsive observers of emotional information, which means they do not simply feel hurt in the ordinary sense. They study the meaning of the hurt, the intention behind it, and the pattern around it. Many people make the mistake of assuming that because the empath remains calm, forgiving, or quiet, the issue is past. But silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is analysis. Sometimes it is the mind gathering evidence, organizing memories, and reaching conclusions that words have not yet revealed. What makes the consequences feel brutal is that an empath usually does not react in immediate, theatrical ways. They tend to give chances, search for context, and hope that misunderstanding can be corrected through patience and compassion. This is why people who mistreat them often become overconfident. They think they have escaped accountability because the empath did not explode, expose, or retaliate. But the empath is not ignoring the wound. They are understanding it. They are comparing today's behavior with yesterday's promises, testing sincerity against repetition, and asking whether the relationship is built on mutual respect or simply on access to their emotional energy. This is a critical lesson in human relationships. Repeated harm eventually removes the emotional benefit of the doubt. Once an empath recognizes that the pain is not accidental but patterned, something changes inside them. Their compassion becomes disciplined, their forgiveness becomes limited, their attention becomes selective. The brutal consequence, then, is not revenge in a dramatic sense, but the removal of access. The person who once received patience, deep listening, emotional safety, and quiet support begins to feel the absence of those gifts. And absence, when it comes from someone who cared sincerely, can be more powerful than any argument. This is why the real loss is often experienced too late by the one who caused the damage. People frequently underestimate the value of a deeply caring person because consistency feels ordinary while it is still available. They get used to being understood, forgiven, supported, and emotionally held together by someone who asks for very little in return except honesty and respect. But when that person finally withdraws, the vacuum becomes undeniable. The one who caused the hurt may suddenly realize that they did not merely lose a relationship, they lost rare emotional intelligence, trust, loyalty, and a level of genuine concern that cannot easily be replaced. From an educational perspective, this teaches an important principle. The most valuable people in life are often not the most obvious ones, but the ones whose presence quietly strengthens others. An empath often carries emotional labor that goes unseen until it disappears. They remember details, notice suffering without being told, and create a sense of safety that many people only appreciate after losing it. That is why the consequence is called brutal. It is not about punishment. It is about irreversible realization. Once trust has been broken enough times, the empath's detachment can become permanent, because clarity teaches them that love without respect becomes self-destruction. The deeper motivational lesson is not merely do not hurt an empath, but do not confuse kindness with endless tolerance. And if you are an empath, do not confuse love with the duty to remain where you are repeatedly wounded. Emotional sensitivity is not a flaw that must be hidden. It is a strength that must be protected with boundaries. A healthy empath is not someone who can survive unlimited disrespect while remaining soft and available to everyone. A healthy empath is someone who knows when care must be balanced with distance, when understanding must be balanced with standards, and when loyalty must stop serving people who only consume it. Growth begins when the empath realizes that protecting peace is not selfish, saying no is not cruelty, and leaving damaging environments is not betrayal. It is wisdom. So the final lesson is powerful for everyone. If someone offers you sincere care, treat it with honor before it turns into distance. And if you are the one carrying that care, remember that your gift becomes strongest when it is guided by self-respect. The harshest consequence of hurting an empath is not what they do to others, but what they finally stop doing for those who never valued them properly. And once that withdrawal is complete, the lesson usually arrives when it is already too late.